A few minutes, but first, Minnesota joining the fight to lift the United States trade embargo with Cuba, which can, of course, only be lifted by an act of Congress. Earlier this month in Minneapolis, a coalition of businesses and organizations launched the Engage Cuba Minnesota State Council to support a new relationship with the two countries. And joining us now with much more on this effort is Cargill's Vice President, Mike Fernandez. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
First, tell us about this council.
Well, the council is really a bipartisan group of business leaders throughout the country that really want to end the embargo after more than 50 years. We tried it one way to see if we could change things in Cuba. That has not worked. That clearly has not worked. And we just think that there's a lot of opportunity, not only for business, but for the Cuban people in terms of connectivity to people outside the island. And that in itself will be a little bit of liberation for those people.
And you have close connections to your
grandfather. My grandfather grew up in Cuba and in Havana, and back in August I had an opportunity to go back and trace roots a little bit.
Wow, that is fantastic. Talk a little bit more about what lifting the trade embargo would mean specifically for Minnesota.
Yeah, well, specifically for Minnesota, it's interesting, the Cuban government, when I first met with the head of foreign direct investment for the Cuban ministry, what they shared with us was a very thick volume, I think it was like almost 200 pages, of different opportunities that they'd love to partner with American businesses on, and they included things like food and agriculture. They included things like health and biomedical devices. It included, obviously tourism and hospitality, and energy. And so we've got even people in Minnesota who are very interested in seeing what they might be able to do in terms of business around renewable energy.
So do you have a whole team at Cargill that's focused on what happens if this actually goes through?
Well, we're clearly looking at it, and we've kind of been in the game looking at it and seeing if we can influence the opportunity to normalize relationships with Cuba for over 2 or 3 years. And part of that comes not just because of Cuba, but because of what this does to relationships across Latin America for the United States and for American business. For 50-plus years, people in Latin America had said, this is kind of silly that you don't have a relationship with an island 90 miles off your coast with more than 11 million people. So we're hoping to solve that.
Well, of course, the critics and some of the historians that are still worried it is still a communist country. And some people are concerned that pumping a bunch of money into Cuba might not be the best thing for the country, that they need their own source of new revenue. What do you say to the critics about this?
But for over 50 years, people in Cuba have been isolated from the rest of the world. We're going to give them that opportunity to exchange goods, to exchange conversations, open up the internet, have more visitors to the island. All of that's going to be a tremendous opportunity for at least intellectual liberation for the people of Cuba. And
so Engage Cuba is a small group of states right now, Minnesota being among them, but you're trying to grow that.
Yeah, the group was really pieced together in the last several months as it looked like there was a bigger opportunity for change on this question. Obviously, key members of the Minnesota delegation have been really focused on this and have done a terrific job. Amy Klobuchar jumped in the middle of this right from the get-go. Tom Emmer, local congressman, also has been engaged with this.
They're part of the Obama's delegation that went down there
that just recently went down. And we would hope that we could get all members of the delegation to come along because it is important to Minnesota, trade opportunities.
So what do you see as the next steps?
Well, the next step really is with Congress. Because what's happened is the Obama administration has taken the steps it basically can in the interim, opening up a little bit of travel, trying to work at the margins in terms of what the current law will allow. But until we get the embargo removed, it's going to be very, very difficult. And if we don't get it removed, what's happening already, the European Union's already normalized relations with Cuba. Canada does trade with Cuba. Many Latin American countries already do trade with Cuba. So we need to get in the game.
It'll be interesting to see where this goes.
Yes.
Mike Fernandez from Cargill, thank you so much for your time. We'll be watching where this goes, and it's historic in many ways to even have this conversation and be this close.